Lyari, a name that carries fear. Lyari is not a name spoken lightly. In Karachi, the word itself carries a pause, a hesitation that signals memory, fear, and judgment all at once. For decades, Lyari has existed in the national imagination not as a place, but as a warning, a shorthand for danger, a label powerful enough to erase nuance and humanity in a single breath. But places do not become feared overnight, and reputations are rarely born from a single cause. Lyari's story is not one of sudden collapse. It is one of gradual suffocation. To outsiders, Lyari has often been reduced to images of gunfire, police raids, and crime statistics. But statistics do not wake up in the morning. They do not raise children. They do not live with consequences. Behind every headline is a dense, breathing community shaped by decades of decisions made far away from its streets. This documentary is not an attempt to excuse violence, nor to romanticize survival. It is an attempt to understand how fear becomes structural, how neglect becomes inherited, and how entire neighborhoods are trapped inside narratives they did not write. A city inside a city. Geographically, Lyari occupies a deeply uncomfortable position. It sits close to Karachi's commercial and political arteries, near ports, transport routes, and centers of economic power. Yet despite this proximity, Lyari has long functioned like a parallel city, visible but disconnected. Urban planners often describe such places as informal, but there is nothing informal about the systems people build to survive when formal ones fail them. The streets of Lyari are narrow not by design, but by necessity. Homes were built vertically and horizontally without long-term planning, each addition responding to immediate need rather than future safety. Overcrowding became normal. Infrastructure lagged behind population growth. Drainage, sanitation, electricity, and public transport struggled to keep pace. When systems strain constantly, breakdown becomes routine. Everyday life in Lyari required adaptation to water shortages, power cuts, overcrowded schools, and limited healthcare access. This was not chaos, it was forced improvisation. Before the violence. Lyari is among Karachi's oldest settlements, carrying layers of history that predate the modern Pakistani state. After the partition of British India in 1947, Karachi experienced explosive growth almost overnight. Millions arrived, fleeing violence, seeking opportunity, or simply looking for stability. The city expanded faster than its ability to absorb new residents. Lyari became one of the primary pressure points where this overflow settled. Communities formed around shared ethnicity, language, and history, creating strong internal bonds. Political loyalty emerged not from ignorance, but from hope. Hope that representation would translate into protection and progress. For decades, Lyari delivered unwavering support, election after election. That loyalty shaped its identity, but it also became its trap. When support is guaranteed, accountability weakens. Development slows. Attention shifts elsewhere. Lyari waited, trusted, and adjusted, until adjustment became endurance. Neglect as a system. Neglect rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as delay. A school renovation postponed, a hospital expansion shelved, a road repair promised next year instead of this one. Over time, these delays compound. In Lyari, neglect hardened into structure. Educational institutions struggled with overcrowding and underfunding. Healthcare facilities were overwhelmed. Employment opportunities remained limited, especially for youth entering adulthood with few pathways forward. This environment did not create criminals. It created vulnerability. When legitimate avenues for mobility shrink, alternatives expand. Neglect is not neutral. It actively reshapes behavior. Frustration builds. Trust erodes. And slowly, informal systems begin to appear where formal ones are absent. This is the point where Lyari's story begins to change tone, not because its people changed, but because their options did. When power changes hands. When state authority weakens, power does not vanish. It relocates. In Lyari, local groups began to fill gaps left by absent institutions. Initially, these groups provided protection, mediation, and financial assistance. They solved problems the system ignored. But power without oversight always expands. Protection turned into control. Mediation turned into enforcement. Assistance turned into extortion. Territories formed invisibly but decisively. Residents learned which streets belonged to whom, when movement was safe and when silence was survival. Violence became episodic rather than constant, but unpredictability shaped daily behavior more than frequency ever could. Gunfire was not always heard, but its possibility was always felt. Lyari became governed by parallel authority, structured, disciplined, and ruthless. Politics, collusion, and abandonment. Politics did not stand outside this transformation. Lyari's voting power made it strategically valuable, but that value was transactional. Support was expected, not earned. Armed groups and political interests gradually overlapped, creating an ecosystem where instability served certain agendas. Development funds were allocated but not delivered. Accountability was diluted. Violence became background noise in political calculations. This was not accidental neglect, it was managed abandonment. Lyari remained visible enough to matter, but invisible enough to be ignored. Elections repeated familiar promises, while structural problems remained untouched. Over time, residents learned a painful lesson. Participation did not guarantee protection, and loyalty did not ensure dignity. Security operations and their shadows. Eventually, the scale of violence forced intervention. Security operations entered Lyari with overwhelming force, attempting to dismantle entrenched power structures. For some residents, these operations brought relief and a sense of regained control. For others, they brought displacement, fear, and renewed trauma. Homes were searched, neighborhoods sealed, and daily routines disrupted. While gang dominance weakened, the psychological cost was immense. Trust between residents and institutions, already fragile, eroded further. Violence may have receded from the streets, but it lingered in memory. Trauma does not end when operations conclude. It embeds itself in behavior, expectations, and emotional survival strategies. Childhood under pressure. Growing up in Lyari meant learning emotional regulation under extreme conditions. Children developed heightened awareness, reading environments for danger signals adults often ignore. Chronic exposure to instability reshaped their understanding of normalcy. Fear was not dramatic. It was practical. It informed decisions, friendships, and futures. Trauma became generational, transmitted not through stories, but through caution, aggression, and silence. Yet within this pressure, resilience formed. Families relied heavily on each other. Community bonds tightened. Survival became collective rather than individual. Football, culture, and identity. Amid violence and uncertainty, soccer emerged as Lyari's most powerful counter-narrative. The sport offered structure, discipline, and aspiration. On improvised grounds, young players chased dreams larger than their circumstances. Lyari became known for producing exceptional football talent. not as an anomaly, but as a consequence of hunger. Hunger for escape, recognition, and dignity. Cultural traditions persisted alongside sport. Music, festivals, and communal gatherings reinforced identity. These were not distractions. They were resistance. They reminded residents that Lyari was more than its reputation. Lyari today. Today, Lyari exists in a fragile calm. Violence has reduced, infrastructure projects have begun, and new voices demand opportunity rather than survival. Yet history does not disappear quietly. Economic challenges remain. Educational gaps persist. Trust in institutions is tentative at best. Lyari stands at a crossroads. Its future depends not on silence, but on sustained commitment. Without structural change, progress risks becoming temporary. What Lyari teaches us. Lyari is not an exception. It is a case study, a mirror reflecting what happens when urban growth outpaces planning, when loyalty replaces accountability, and when communities are remembered only during crises. Lyari did not choose violence. It adapted to abandonment. Understanding Lyari means understanding how cities fracture and how easily neglect becomes normalized. Why this story matters. Stories like Lyari's demand patience, not judgment. Behind every feared neighborhood are systems that failed and people who endured. If knowledge should challenge assumptions instead of reinforcing them, if stories should explain rather than sensationalize, then this is what Brain Tenacity exists for. Subscribe to the channel, because understanding the world deeply is no longer optional. It is essential.